emancipation, the Greek Revolution's impact on the American Abolitionist Movement, and the American Civil War. Tonight, I would like to explore a remarkable transatlantic story, one that begins with the outbreak of the Greek War of Independence in 1821 and extends across oceans into the moral and political life of the United States. It is not only a story of revolution, but of influence, of how the struggle for Hellenic liberty helped reshape American political consciousness, energized the abolitionist movement, and even echoed into the battlefields of the American Civil War. In 2026, we commemorate the two great anniversaries, the 205th anniversary of the Greek Revolution and the 250th anniversary of the American Declaration of Independence, and the main themes of this year's Greek Independence Parade in New York on April 26. These milestones invite us to reflect not simply on sovereignty, but on the shared ideals of liberty, justice, and moral responsibility that bind the histories of Hellas and the United States into a deeper ideological fellowship. When the Greek Revolution began in 1821, the language of the American Revolution was still reverberating across the Atlantic world. The revolutionary proclamations of Hellenic leaders, including figures like Alexandros Ypsilantis and Theodoros Kolokotronis, consciously echoed the American model. These documents listed grievances against Ottoman rule, much as the Declaration of Independence had listed grievances against the crown. They invoked the rights of man, appealed to divine justice, and a principle fundamental to the Republican political thought, that tyranny nullifies political legitimacy. American observers immediately recognized the parallels. Clergymen from New England to Pennsylvania compared the Moria, the Peloponnesian uprising, to Lexington and Concord. The heroic resistance at Thessaloniki was likened to Valley Forge. Hellenic insurgents were hailed not as rebels, but as patriots, heirs to the same Enlightenment tradition that had animated 1776. For Americans, these comparisons were not abstract rhetorical flourishes. They shaped the moral universe in which domestic debates over justice, particularly slavery, would increasingly take place. To affirm the legitimacy of Greek resistance abroad was implicitly to open the door to questioning injustice at home. The American response to the Greek Revolution was swift and unprecedented. Philhellenic committees, as we have mentioned before, formed in cities like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. Leaders like Edward Everett and Daniel Webster spoke publicly in support of Hellenic independence. Mass meetings were held. Funds were raised through church collections. Pamphlets circulated widely. Newspapers serialized accounts of Hellenic suffering under Ottoman oppression. These activities effectively created some of the first coordinated nationwide civic activism networks in American history. By the 1830s, abolitionists would employ many of the same tools pioneered during the Greek cause: moral suasion, printed appeals, emotional narratives, lecture tours, and interstate correspondence networks. Philhellenism became, in effect, a rehearsal for American social reform movements. Among those who bridged these worlds was, as we mentioned last week, or a couple of weeks ago, Samuel Grigley Howard, Jonathan Peckham Miller, George Canning Hill, and John Zaklos, individuals whose activism in Hellas would later find expression in abolitionist and Reconstruction era efforts. Perhaps the most poignant human link between the revolutions came in the form of Hellenic war orphans brought to the United States following atrocities such as the massacre of Chios. These children, survivors of imperial violence, embodied the cost of tyranny and transformed distant geopolitical struggles into immediate moral realities for American families who adopted or educated them. John Zakos would later teach formerly enslaved African Americans during Reconstruction, advancing literacy and civic education. George Kovalresis survived the Chios massacre and went on to serve as a Union naval officer in the Civil War. George Syrian, another Greek orphan, served nearly 50 years in the U.S. Navy, including active wartime duty. American literature amplified these connections. Writers such as Lydia Sigourney published works like The Greek Boy, which depicted exile, suffering, and the moral obligation to aid the oppressed. Hellenic children became moral archetypes, and in doing so helped shape an American consciousness increasingly sensitive to the plight of enslaved peoples. African American intellectuals quickly recognized a contradiction in American Philhellenism. If liberty was sacred for Greeks resisting Ottoman domination, how could it be denied to Black Americans living under slavery? David Walker, in his 1829 appeal, invoked American enthusiasm for Greece while condemning domestic bondage. William Lloyd Garrison drew parallels between Ottoman despotism and Southern slaveholding. Early Black newspapers, such as Freedom's Journal, used Greek imagery to advocate emancipation. The Greek Revolution thus became a moral mirror, sharpening abolitionist critique and supplying symbolic tools with which to challenge American hypocrisy. Some Americans went beyond rhetoric and fought in Greece. Samuel Brigley Howard served, as we had mentioned before, as a surgeon in Revolutionary Hellas, and later became a supporter of John Brown, ultimately serving on the Freedmen's Inquiry Commission. Jonathan Peckham Miller returned from Hellas to become an abolitionist legislator and supporter of the Underground Railroad. Having witnessed siege warfare and civilian suffering firsthand, these men viewed liberty not as romantic abstraction, but as lived necessity, and their experiences abroad radicalized their commitment to universal emancipation. Art also carried a moral message. In 1844, sculptor Hiram Powers unveiled The Greek Slave, depicting a young woman in chains under Ottoman captivity. Though Europe in origin, American abolitionists increasingly interpreted the sculpture as an allegory for enslaved persons in the United States. Writers such as John Greenleaf Whittier used the work as a platform to discuss freedom's universality. Hellenic suffering thus entered the American moral imagination, bridging distant geopolitical struggles with domestic consciousness. The intellectual and moral groundwork laid by Philhellenism bore fruit during the Civil War. As we mentioned before, John Calvocaresis served as a Union naval commander aboard vessels, including the USS Saratoga. George Syrian served again with distinction in the U.S. Navy. Other Hellenes enlisted in Union infantry and naval units in major port cities, such as New York and Boston. A similar number, particularly in Louisiana, served as in Confederate units, such as the 10th Louisiana Infantry. For many, participation was philosophical as well as martial. The Union increasingly came to symbolize emancipation, and Hellenic-born Americans, heirs to the revolutionary ethos of 1821, joined in the defense of liberty. Hellenic merchant networks also played a subtle role in Civil War politics. Operating across Mediterranean trade routes, Hellenic commercial intermediaries helped facilitate Egyptian cotton exports to British textile mills, offering alternatives to Southern cotton during the Union blockade. This contributed in part to Britain's continued neutrality and deprived the Confederacy of critical diplomatic recognition. Thus, Hellenic networks were intertwined with both the moral and material dimensions of emancipation. By the late 19th century, larger waves of Hellenic immigrants arrived in a United States already transformed by civil war and abolition. The earlier generation, veterans, orphans, educators, merchants, became central to the communal memory. Churches and associations would preserve narratives of the Hellenic contribution to American liberty, eventually institutionalized through organizations like the American Hellenic Educational Progressive Association. These memories reinforce a shared revolutionary linking 1776, 1821, and 1865. As the United States commemorates the 250th anniversary of independence, and the Hellenic Republic marks the 205th year since 1821, these anniversaries remind us that liberty is neither self-sustained nor automatically universal. Both revolutions require international support, sacrifice, and moral clarity. Abolitionism, partly informed by the Hellenic struggle, represents the practical effort to align principle with practice. The Greek Revolution did not create American abolitionism, but it accelerated it, energized it, supplied it with language, personnel, and precedent. It exposed moral contradictions, trained activists, humanized suffering, influenced diplomacy, and sent individuals from Zachos to Kovokoresis into American public life and military service. From Mesologi to acromatics, from Chios to reconstruction classrooms, liberty traveled across the Atlantic and returned transformed. Zito Elas, and God bless America. Thank you. For those who came late, let me just read the first part so everybody understands what I was talking about. Okay, so tonight, because February is Black History Month in America, my lecture really was called Philhellenism and Emancipation, the Greek Revolution's impact on the American Abolitionist Movement and the American Civil War. Okay, so this is important thematically to what we've been talking about this particular parade. Extremely important for people to understand our linkage over time. Okay, so thank you. And 7 o'clock, of course, we start our regular meeting. Any questions? Yes.
I just want to mention that African Americans also raised funds
Yes.
for the revolution as well.
Excellent.
Contributed.
Now, we have, just so everybody knows, and we'll talk about it later, but the Haitians are going to march with us, okay? As well as the
Polish and the Lord Byron.
As well as the Polish contingent, as well as the Lord Byron Foundation,
Society of America.
As well as the Greek Jewish synagogue in Lower Manhattan. So we're going to continue, and we'll have that discussion, and I'll discuss also the other countries that I'd like to participate in this particular parade. 7 o'clock we start. Ahora por irte a la canto de Philip. Thank you for showing me respect. I demand respect when I speak.
Espera,